My name is Harper Callahan. I'm 34 years old, and I run a corporate restructuring firm that 14 distressed companies in the Midwest have hired to save them from bankruptcy. Worthless. That's the word my father used to describe me, standing in front of 11 business partners at the Winter Garden Steakhouse in Dayton, Ohio, on the evening of September 9, 2024, while I was sitting less than 4 feet away from him with a glass of untouched Cabernet in my hand. What none of those 11 men in that private dining room knew, what my father himself didn't fully understand yet, was that the attorney sitting 2 seats down from him, the one who drafted every contract Callahan Brothers Construction had signed in the last 6 years, had been on retainer with my advisory firm since March. I want you to remember that detail, because by the end of the story, it's the reason everything my father built came apart in his own hands, not mine. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. I read every single one, and knowing you're out there listening means more than you'd think. Now let me take you back to where this actually started, long before that dinner, long before the word worthless ever left my father's mouth. I grew up in a town called Fairborn, about 15 minutes outside Dayton, in a split-level house on Kestrel Lane that my father built with his own hands in 1987, 3 years before I was born. Richard Callahan still is, the founder of Callahan Brothers Construction, a commercial development company that started with residential remodels and grew, over 3 decades, into a firm that built strip malls, warehouses, and eventually mid-rise office parks across 3 counties. My father is not a subtle man. He measures people the way he measures lumber, by whether they're load-bearing or decorative. For most of my childhood, I was decorative. My younger brother, Tyler, born 4 years after me, was load-bearing, at least in my father's mind, from the day he was old enough to hold a tape measure. I remember being 9 years old, standing in the mudroom of that house on Kestrel Lane, watching my father hand Tyler, who was 5, a hard hat with Callahan Jr., stenciled on the side in white paint, custom ordered from a shop in Springfield. I asked if I could have one too. My father laughed, not cruelly, just distractedly, the way you laugh at something that isn't really a question, and said, "Sweetheart, this isn't really your thing." I didn't understand yet what your thing meant. I would spend the next 25 years understanding it in increasingly expensive detail. By the time I was in high school at Fairborn Digital Academy, the pattern had calcified into something structural. Tyler got taken to job sites on Saturdays. Tyler got introduced to subcontractors and city inspectors by name. Tyler got handed at 16 the keys to a used Ford F-150 with the Callahan Brothers logo magnetized to the door. "So people get used to seeing a Callahan behind the wheel," my father said. "I got a used Honda Civic and a piece of advice. Get good grades so you can find a stable husband who'll take care of the number stuff." I was 16 years old and already better at accounting than my father's actual bookkeeper, a woman named Denise who used to let me check her spreadsheets for errors because, in her words, "You catch things I don't." I want to be precise here, because precision is the entire foundation of what I do for a living now. My father was not abusive in the way that makes for a tidy villain. He never raised a hand to me. He paid for my education, mostly. He came to my college graduation, sat in the 4th row of the Wright State University auditorium in May of 2012, and clapped when I walked across the stage with a bachelor's degree in finance and a minor in construction management, a minor I'd chosen specifically, though I never told him this, because some stubborn part of me still wanted him to see me as load-bearing. He clapped. He also left the reception 40 minutes early because Tyler had a football scrimmage. That's the asymmetry I need you to understand before anything else in this story makes sense. It was never one dramatic betrayal. It was 1,000 small ones, stacked so evenly across 2 decades that by the time I was 26, I'd stopped noticing the weight of them individually. I only noticed the total. After college, I didn't go work for my father, though he assumed I would, in some administrative capacity, handling the office side. As he put it once at a Thanksgiving dinner, in front of my aunt and uncle, as though my entire professional future had already been decided and simply hadn't been announced to me yet. Instead, I took a job at a regional bank in Columbus, in their commercial lending division, underwriting loans for exactly the kind of mid-sized construction and development companies my father's firm resembled. I was good at it, unnervingly good, according to my supervisor, a woman named Patricia Ostrowski, who 6 months into my employment pulled me into her office and told me I had the sharpest read on distressed balance sheets she'd seen in 15 years of banking. I didn't tell my father about that conversation. I'm not sure he would have understood why it mattered more to me than anything he'd ever said. By 2018, I'd left the bank and joined a boutique restructuring advisory firm called Faro Meridian Partners, based out of Cincinnati, where I specialize in turning around distressed construction and real estate development companies, the kind of firms that had overextended themselves on debt, mismanaged project cash flow, or gotten caught holding half-finished developments when a market shifted. It is, if you want the blunt version, the exact opposite of what my father did for a living. He built things up from nothing. I walked into companies that were already collapsing and figured out whether they could be saved, and if they could, how. By 2021, at 31 years old, I was a managing director at Faro Meridian, and in January of 2023, with 2 former colleagues, I co-founded my own firm, Callahan Voss Restructuring Advisory, based in Columbus, with 11 employees and, by the end of that first year, $4.1 million in contracted advisory revenue. I used my own name on the letterhead. That detail matters later, so hold on to it. Meanwhile, Tyler had gone to work for Callahan Brothers full-time straight out of high school, skipping college entirely because, in my father's words, he doesn't need a piece of paper telling him what he already knows how to do. By 2020, at 26 years old, Tyler held the title of Vice President of Operations, a title that, when I later reviewed the company's internal structure during circumstances I'll explain shortly, I discovered had never been formally voted on by the company's 3-member board. My father had simply started calling him that, and it stuck, the way titles do in family businesses where nobody's checking anyone's math. The trigger, the actual hinge point of the story, happened over 11 months, not 11 minutes, though it would culminate that September evening at the Winter Garden. In October of 2023, Callahan Brothers broke ground on the largest project in the company's history, a $6.3 million mixed-use retail development in Beaver Creek called Kestrel Commons, named, I assume without irony, after the street I grew up on. Tyler was the project lead. I know this not because my father told me. We spoke maybe 4 times a year by then, brief, logistical calls about holidays, but because in February of 2024, a company called Meridian Bank of Ohio, one of Callahan Brothers' primary lenders, reached out to Callahan Voss Restructuring Advisory to conduct an independent review of the Kestrel Commons project's cost overruns. They didn't reach out to me by name. They reached out to my firm. I was assigned the engagement by my own partners before anyone in that room realized whose father's name was on the building permits. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I certainly had to. I spent 3 weeks in March of 2024 reviewing my own father's company's books without him knowing it was me on the other end of the engagement letter. The review was conducted through a subsidiary entity, standard practice for sensitive commercial reviews, and my name never crossed his desk. What I found was $890,000 in cost overruns that had been quietly absorbed through change orders that, in my professional opinion, existed to disguise a much simpler problem. Tyler had approved a subcontractor bid that was $310,000 below market rate from a company that, it turned out, had no verifiable completion history and was, according to state licensing records, only 4 months old. The subcontractor walked off the job in January, halfway through the foundation work, and Callahan Brothers had spent the 2 months since quietly patching the gap with change orders billed to the bank as unforeseen site conditions, which was not, strictly speaking, true. The bank's findings, delivered under my firm's name, recommended Callahan Brothers Construction secure an additional personal guarantee before releasing the next $1.2 million draw on the loan. That guarantee needed 2 signatures, my father's, and, because of a cross-collateralization clause tied to a property my grandmother had left jointly to both her grandchildren, a 4-acre parcel on Kestrel Lane worth roughly $340,000, mine. My father called me on April 2nd, 2024, at 6:40 in the evening. I remember because I was still at my office on Gay Street in Columbus, and the light through the window had that particular flat gray quality that early spring evenings in Ohio get right before it rains. He didn't ask how I was. He said, Meridian's lawyer says they need your signature on the Kestrel guarantee. It's a formality. Denise will email you the paperwork tonight. I told him I needed to review it first. He said, "Harper, it's your grandmother's land. It's already half yours. This isn't complicated." I told him I'd already reviewed it. I didn't tell him how, and that I wasn't going to co-sign a personal guarantee on a project with an unresolved subcontractor default and change orders I couldn't verify were accurate. I told him, specifically, that I needed an independent audit of the change order documentation before I'd put my name, or my grandmother's land, behind another $1.2 million in exposure. There was a long silence on the phone. Then he said, "So that's a no." "That's a no, Dad. Not forever. Just until I see documentation that makes sense." He hung up without saying goodbye, which by our standards wasn't unusual, but the silence that followed it, 5 months of it, no calls, no texts, nothing was. It ended on September 9th, at the Winter Garden Steakhouse, at a dinner I only attended because Tyler texted me that morning saying it would mean a lot to Dad if I came, that they were closing on refinancing for Kestrel Commons, and Dad wanted the whole family there. I believe now that Tyler didn't know what was actually going to happen. I believe he genuinely thought it was a celebration. I was wrong to trust that belief, but I want to be fair to him because fairness is something I've had to practice deliberately in this family since it was rarely modeled for me. The private room at the Winter Garden sat 11 of my father's business associates, 2 other contractors, a commercial realtor named Doug Preston, a city councilman, and, at the far end of the table, an attorney named Marcus Whitfield of Whitfield and Ross, the firm that had represented Callahan Brothers Construction for the better part of 9 years. I didn't know yet, that night, that Whitfield and Ross had been retained by Callahan Voss Restructuring Advisory in March of that same year for an unrelated matter involving a different client, an arrangement negotiated by my business partner, Elena Voss, who had no idea Marcus Whitfield's other major client was my father. Neither did Marcus, apparently, connect the dots that evening, not until later. My father stood up around 8:30, glass in hand, to make what I assumed would be a toast about the refinancing closing. Instead, he looked directly at me, in front of all 11 men, and said, "You know, some kids grow up and build something. Others just sit on the sidelines with their spreadsheets, telling everybody else what they did wrong. My daughter's real good at telling people no. She wouldn't sign a piece of paper to save her own brother's project. Wouldn't even come to the job site to look at it herself. Worthless when it actually mattered. The room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when everyone present understands something has just gone too far but nobody wants to be the first to acknowledge it. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I set my wine glass down on the white tablecloth. Carefully, the way you set down something when your hands are working very hard to stay steady, and I said, "I didn't refuse to help, Dad. I refused to sign my name to change orders I couldn't verify on a subcontractor default nobody in this room has been told about." I looked, briefly, at Marcus Whitfield, who had gone very still. If anyone at this table wants to know what actually happened with the Beaver Creek Foundation work, I'd be happy to explain it. But I won't do it by pretending I did something wrong tonight. My father's face did something I'd never seen it do before. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of cornered stillness, like a man realizing the ground under a building he trusted had already shifted before he ever felt it move. He said quietly, "Get out, Harper," and I did. I stood up, thanked the 2 partners nearest me for the evening, and walked out of the Winter Garden into a parking lot lit orange by sodium lamps, and I sat in my car for 11 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. I didn't hear from my father again for the rest of that month. Tyler texted twice, short, apologetic, confused messages that I answered but didn't linger over because I understood he was caught in the same current I'd been swimming against my entire life, just from a more comfortable position in the boat. The person who called me that night, at 10:52 p.m., was Elena Voss, my business partner, who I told exactly one true thing about all evening. That dinner with my family had gone badly. She didn't ask for details. She just said, "Come over. I've got a bottle of Tempranillo in a spare room, and you are not driving back to your apartment alone tonight in whatever state you're in." Elena had been my mentor at Faro Meridian before she was my partner, 15 years older than me, no children of her own, and something close to the professional mother I hadn't realized I needed until I was sitting on her couch at 11 that night, still in the same dress I'd worn to the Winter Garden, finally letting my shoulders drop for the first time in 5 months. He called me worthless. I told her, In front of 11 people who do business with him, Elena poured 2 glasses and said something I've thought about nearly every day since. Harper, worthless people don't get hired to review 9-figure loan portfolios. Worthless people don't build firms with their name on the letterhead in 18 months. Your father just told an entire room exactly how badly he's underestimated you. That's not an insult. That's a blind spot with a microphone. I didn't feel powerful that night. I felt hollowed out. The particular exhaustion of finally hearing out loud the thing you'd suspected about yourself your whole childhood, confirmed by the one voice you'd always secretly hoped would say the opposite. But something had also, quietly, permanently shifted. I wasn't the 16-year-old girl checking Denise's spreadsheets for a gold star anymore. I ran a firm. I had a partner who believed in me without qualification. And somewhere in a filing cabinet in my Columbus office was a signed engagement letter connecting Callahan Voss Restructuring Advisory to Whitfield and Ross, my father's own attorney, for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with my family, and everything, eventually, to do with what came next. The following year would be the quietest of my adult life, at least where my father was concerned. No calls, no holiday texts beyond the obligatory ones from Tyler. I threw myself into the firm instead. We closed 2024 with $6.8 million in revenue, took on our first out-of-state client, a distressed logistics company in Louisville, and I got promoted, in every sense that mattered, by nobody but myself and Elena, into the version of my life where worthless was simply a word a tired, proud man had said in a steakhouse, and not a verdict I had to carry anywhere else. I didn't know it yet, but Kestrel Commons was already beginning to buckle under its own weight. 4 months behind schedule and quietly bleeding cash my father hadn't told anyone about, including his own board. And somewhere in a downtown office building in Columbus, Marcus Whitfield was about to find himself in the extremely uncomfortable position of representing 2 clients whose interests were on a collision course, one of them my father and the other one me. Year 1 of the silence taught me how to live without a father who called. Year 2 taught me how to stop waiting for the phone to ring at all. By January of 2025, Callahan Voss Restructuring Advisory had grown to 16 employees and moved into a larger office suite on Gay Street, the kind with a conference room that actually fit 12 people around a table instead of 8 crammed elbow to elbow. I'd started keeping a folder, not a metaphorical one, an actual navy blue accordion binder I bought at an Office Depot in November of 2024, where I saved things I told myself I'd never need but couldn't bring myself to throw away. The engagement letter from Meridian Bank. The email chain with Whitfield and Ross confirming the retainer agreement dated March 11, 2024. A printed copy of a text Tyler sent me the morning after the Wintergarten dinner, which read in full, "I'm sorry, Harper, I didn't know he was going to do that, I swear." I saved that one because some part of me, even furious, still believed him. I called it the Kestrel file, after the street, after the land, after the whole tangled root system of the thing. Elena used to see it sitting on the corner of my desk and say, half joking, "That folder's going to end up being the most important document either of us ever touches," and I'd wave her off because in year 1, it still felt like something I was keeping out of stubbornness, not strategy. Year 2 is when the numbers started talking louder than the silence. In March of 2025, Callahan Voss picked up a $2.4 million advisory contract restructuring debt for a regional grocery chain out of Toledo, the kind of engagement that got written up in the Columbus Business Journal's quarterly roundup of notable regional deals. A 4-paragraph mention, my name spelled correctly, a small headshot I hadn't even known they'd requested from our marketing coordinator. I didn't send it to my father. I didn't need to. Fairborn is a small town, and small towns talk, and by April, Denise, my father's bookkeeper for over a decade, the same woman who used to let a 16-year-old check her spreadsheets, sent me a private message on LinkedIn that said only, "Saw the article. Proud of you. Please don't tell your dad I said that." I didn't tell him. I did keep the message, printed and folded into the Kestrel binder, because it was the first unprompted kindness that had come out of that entire zip code in a year and a half. The business kept climbing. By August of 2025, we'd hit $9.2 million in annual contracted revenue, and I'd been asked to speak on a panel at the Ohio Turnaround Management Association's fall conference in Cleveland, Distress Construction, reading the balance sheet before the building falls down. A title Elena picked, grinning, because she knew exactly how close it cut to the bone of my own family, and I let her keep it anyway, because there's a particular kind of relief in turning your wound into your area of expertise. Meanwhile, 400 miles of silence sat between Fairborn and Columbus, broken only twice. The first time was in June of 2025, a text from an unknown number that turned out to be my father's new office manager, asking, with a formality that felt almost apologetic, whether I'd be attending the Callahan brothers' 20th anniversary open house. An invitation clearly sent from a mailing list, not from my father's own hand, since it addressed me as Miss Callahan rather than by name. I didn't go. The second time was in September, almost exactly a year after the Winter Garden, when a card arrived at my apartment for my 35th birthday. No note inside, just my father's signature, Dad, beneath a printed hallmark verse about family always finding its way back together. I kept that too, not because it moved me, because it was dated, postmarked, and it told me something useful. He was thinking about me again, in a year when Kestrel Commons should have been finished and profitable, and instead, according to public permitting records I checked out of professional habit more than curiosity, was still listed as active construction, 11 months past its original completion date. If you've ever kept a file like mine, the receipts, the screenshots, the one voicemail you never deleted, you know it's not about revenge. It's about not letting anyone rewrite what actually happened. If this is landing for you, you already know exactly what I mean, so tell me in the comments what's in your folder. Tyler and I spoke more than my father and I did, though spoke is generous. It was mostly logistics, birthday texts, a single stilted phone call in November of 2025 when our grandmother's estate attorney needed both our signatures for an unrelated matter involving the Kestrel Lane parcel's property tax reassessment. On that call, Tyler let something slip that he probably regretted the moment it left his mouth. He mentioned, almost offhand, that Dad had brought on a new equity partner for Kestrel Commons that summer, someone Tyler called the guy from Whitfield's office, to help restructure the financing since the bank got difficult. I didn't press him. I didn't need to. I already knew, because Marcus Whitfield's firm had called my office in July asking, with visible discomfort in the attorney's voice, whether Callahan Voss would be willing to formally recuse itself from any future engagements touching Callahan Brothers construction, given what he delicately called an unavoidable conflict of proximity. I signed the recusal. I also kept a copy. By the end of 2025, my firm's valuation, according to an informal assessment Elena and I commissioned ahead of a potential minority investment round, sat at $11.5 million. Callahan Brothers Construction, according to the same public permitting and lien records I'd been quietly tracking out of nothing more than professional muscle memory, had 2 mechanics liens filed against Kestrel Commons in the fourth quarter alone, totaling $214,000 in unpaid subcontractor claims. I didn't celebrate that. I want to be honest about that part, because it would be easy to tell the story as though I felt vindicated watching my father's company falter. I didn't. I felt something closer to dread, the specific dread of watching a slow-motion collision from a distance too far to stop it and too close not to see every detail. The seed of what would eventually bring my family back into a room together was planted in January of 2026, and it came, fittingly, through Denise. She called me directly this time, not a LinkedIn message, an actual phone call, on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice lower than I remembered it, careful in the way people are careful when they're about to say something they've been sitting on for a while. She told me that Meridian Bank had sent Callahan Brothers a formal notice of default on the Kestrel Commons construction loan, that the outstanding balance had ballooned past $5.7 million against a project that was, according to the bank's own reappraisal, worth barely $4.1 million in its current unfinished state, and that my father, who had personally guaranteed the loan alone, after I'd refused to co-sign 18 months earlier, was now personally exposed for the difference. He hasn't told Tyler the full number, Denise said. I don't think he's told anyone the full number. I only know because I still do the books, Harper, and I don't know what I thought. I thought you should know. I sat with that phone call for a long time after it ended. Not because I didn't understand the financial mechanics. I understood them immediately, better than anyone else who could have received that call. I sat with it because I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the version of my father who stood up at the Winter Garden and called me worthless in front of 11 men was now personally, legally, and irreversibly exposed to a debt that existed specifically because he'd refused to do the one thing I'd asked him to do: verify the numbers before betting the family land on them. I didn't reach out. Not yet. I closed the Kestrel binder, set it back on the corner of my desk, and I waited because I had learned, across 18 months of silence, that the Callahan family only ever came looking for me when the numbers finally forced them to. They found their way back to me 4 weeks later. Not through a phone call, and not through Tyler. Through a text from my father, sent at 9:14 on a Thursday morning that read, "Harper, we need to talk. It's about the business. Can I come see you next week?" I stared at that message for 11 minutes before I answered it, the same 11 minutes I'd once sat in a parking lot outside the Winter Garden, and this time, when I finally typed my reply, my hands weren't shaking at all. I told him yes, not because I'd forgiven anything, but because I understood, with the same clarity I bring to every distress balance sheet that crosses my desk, that whatever came out of that meeting would only be useful to me if I let it happen on my terms, in my space, with my name on the door. I told him to come to my office on Gay Street, not the house on Kestrel Lane, not a restaurant, not neutral ground. My office. I wanted him to sit in the chair across from my desk the way every other distressed executive sat across from that desk, because I needed, for reasons I didn't fully articulate even to myself until later, for him to feel the floor of that room belonged to me. He arrived on a Wednesday in February of 2026, 11 minutes early, wearing the same navy blazer he'd worn to my law school graduation party a decade earlier, a blazer that had clearly been let out at the seams since then. He looked smaller than I remembered him. Not physically. My father is still a broad, weathered man, 61 years old with hands that have poured 1,000 foundations, but smaller in the way people look when the certainty has gone out of them. He sat down, and before I could say anything, he said, "This is a nice office, Harper," in a tone that wasn't quite an apology but was reaching for the neighborhood of one. I didn't make it easy for him, and I won't pretend I felt bad about that. I asked him, directly, what he wanted to talk about, and he told me, haltingly, in pieces, the way men like my father tell the truth when they've spent their whole lives avoiding it, that Meridian Bank had called the loan, that he was $1.6 million short of what he owed on his personal guarantee, that Kestrel Commons was sitting half-built and bleeding, carrying costs of roughly $38,000 a month, and that his attorney had suggested, gently, that his daughter's restructuring firm might be able to help him find a path through it. I asked him one question before I agreed to anything. "Does Marcus Whitfield know you're here?" My father blinked. "Marcus? Yeah, he's the one who, he thought it might be a good idea, given everything." That answer told me something my father didn't intend for it to tell me. Marcus Whitfield had known, since March of the previous year, exactly whose office my father was walking into. He'd sat on that knowledge, professionally bound and personally uncomfortable, for nearly a year, waiting for the moment when it would stop being a conflict and start being the only sensible referral left to make. I didn't fault him for it. I understood it completely. What I didn't yet understand, what I wouldn't understand for another 11 days, was that my father hadn't come to that meeting entirely on his own initiative. The detail came to me sideways, the way the most important details in this story always seem to. In late February, I flew to Chicago for a 2-day engagement with a client, and Tyler, of all people, texted me a photo. An accident, I'm certain of that even now, the kind of thing that happens when someone means to send a screenshot to one person and hits the wrong thread. It was a screenshot of a family group chat, one I wasn't part of, titled Callahan Fam, and it showed a message from my Aunt Colleen, my father's older sister, sent 2 days before my father walked into my office. "Rich, just talked to her. She's sitting on millions, and you're about to lose the land Mom left you both. Pride isn't going to pay Meridian back. Worst case, she says no again, and you're no worse off than you are now." I read that message on a plane, somewhere over Indiana, and I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, because it told me plainly what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to fully believe. My father hadn't come back because he missed me, or because he regretted the Winter Garden, or because 18 months of silence had taught him anything about how he'd treated me for 34 years. He'd come back because his sister had done the math for him and realized I was the only remaining asset on the family's balance sheet. I texted Tyler back only 2 words. "Wrong thread?" He responded 11 minutes later, panicked, apologizing, and then, almost as an afterthought, confirmed what I already knew, that the family had discussed my finances, my firm's valuation, and the Kestrel Lane parcel in at least 3 separate conversations before my father ever sent that first "we need to talk" text. I didn't confront anyone yet. I did what I do professionally, which is what I've always done, long before it was my job. I gathered documentation. I asked my father, in our second meeting the following week, to have Whitfield and Ross send over the complete loan file, the original guarantee, the change order history, the mechanic's liens, everything. He agreed, mostly, I think, because he assumed I already had access to most of it, which I did, though not through him. What I hadn't had, until that file arrived, was the internal correspondence between Callahan Brothers and its own board, the 3-member board that, I confirmed reading through the corporate minutes, had never formally authorized Tyler's Vice President of Operations title, exactly as I'd suspected 2 years earlier, and had more troublingly never been informed of the full scope of the Meridian default until 6 weeks after my father received the notice. That was the moment the shape of the whole thing clarified for me. My father hadn't just mismanaged a subcontractor bid in 2024. He'd spent 18 months concealing the scale of Kestrel Commons' failure from his own board, from Denise, and functionally from Tyler, all while quietly hoping the project would right itself before anyone had to know how bad it actually was. The Wintergarten dinner, I understood now with the particular clarity that only comes in hindsight, hadn't just been cruelty. It had been a man standing at the edge of a collapsing project, needing someone to blame before the numbers made the blame obvious on their own. I met with an attorney of my own in early March, not Marcus Whitfield, a colleague of Elena's named Priya Anand, who specialized in family business disputes and cross-collateralized asset structures. I laid out the Kestrel Lane parcel, the guarantee I'd refused to co-sign, the current state of my father's exposure, and asked her plainly what my actual legal position was. Priya's answer was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. Because I'd never signed the guarantee, I had zero personal liability for the Meridian default. None. The $340,000 parcel was jointly owned by Tyler and me, inherited outright from our grandmother, entirely separate from my father's business assets, and could not be seized, liened, or leveraged by Meridian Bank under any circumstance tied to his default. My father did not, in fact, need my signature on anything. What he needed was money, or a restructuring plan, or both, and the family, as it turned out, had spent 18 months hoping I'd offer one before anyone had to ask directly. I want to be honest about how that felt. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like standing at the exact center of a scale I'd been trying to balance my entire life, finally understanding that the weight had shifted entirely to my side of it, and that everyone else in my family already knew it too. The scouting visit, because that's what it was, even though nobody called it that, happened on a Sunday afternoon in mid-March. My father called ahead this time, said he wanted to see where I'd landed, and I let him come to my apartment in German Village, a converted 1890s row house I'd bought outright in 2023 with cash from the firm's first profitable year. He walked through it slowly, quietly, running a hand along the exposed brick in the kitchen, asking pointed, careful questions that had nothing to do with catching up and everything to do with assessment, what the place had cost, what my car was worth, whether the firm owned its office space outright or leased it, whether I had people handling investments for me. He asked about my retirement accounts. My father, who had never once in 34 years asked me a single question about my emotional well-being that I could recall, spent 40 minutes in my apartment auditing my net worth with the practiced discretion of a man who thought he was being subtle about it. By the time he left, I understood, completely and without any remaining ambiguity, what this family's plan for me actually was. Not reconciliation, not an apology, not really, though I believed and still believe that some genuine regret lived somewhere underneath my father's pride. Underneath all of it was a much simpler expectation. That Harper, the daughter who'd once been called worthless in front of 11 men, was now expected to quietly become the family's rescue plan, without anyone having to say the word sorry first, or mean it if they did. 2 days later, Denise called me one final time, her voice tight with something between guilt and urgency, to tell me that my father, Tyler, and Aunt Colleen were driving to Columbus that Friday. Not to talk, to ask, formally, in person, for a $1.6 million bridge loan against my firm's equity to save Kestrel Commons and the family name attached to it, and that my father had already told Marcus Whitfield to draft the paperwork in advance. So we don't waste time once she says yes. I hung up the phone, walked to my desk, and opened the Kestrel binder for the first time in months. I added Denise's message to it, and Aunt Colleen's screenshot, and the corporate minutes showing the board had never been told the truth, and I sat there for a long time in the quiet of my own office, on the 14th floor of a building I had every right to be in, listening to the sound of a family arriving before they'd even left Fairborn. Friday arrived cold and overcast, the kind of gray March sky Ohio specializes in, and I spent the morning doing something I hadn't planned in advance, so much as felt my way toward. The way you feel your way toward the true structural problem underneath a company's books once you've stared at the numbers long enough. I called Priya Anand and asked her to be present. I called Elena and asked the same. And I called Denise, not to ask her to come, but to thank her, quietly, for 18 months of small honesties that had cost her something to give me, and to tell her that whatever happened that afternoon, none of it would ever touch her. They arrived at 2:40 in the afternoon. My father, Tyler, and Aunt Colleen, 11 minutes late, which felt, given everything, like a small and almost funny piece of symmetry. I had them shown into the same conference room where I'd hosted the Toledo grocery chain restructuring, the one with the long walnut table and the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over Gay Street. 12 chairs, only 5 of them filled that afternoon. My father, Tyler, Aunt Colleen on one side, myself and Priya on the other, Elena standing near the door, not seated, arms loosely crossed, present the way a witness is present, not a participant. My father had a leather portfolio under his arm, the kind Whitfield and Ross issued to clients for signing ceremonies, and he set it on the table in front of him with the particular confidence of a man who still believed, somewhere underneath everything, that this meeting would end the way every meeting in his life had ended, with him laying out the terms and everyone else adjusting to fit them. "Harper," he started, before anyone had even sat down properly. "Thank you for making time. I know things have been strained, but I think if we just sit down and talk through the numbers, you'll see this is a straightforward ask." "I've seen the numbers, Dad," I said. "I saw them before you did. Technically, Meridian Bank hired my firm to review the Kestrel Commons cost overruns in February of 2024. I ran that engagement myself. The room went still in a way that reminded me, sharply, of the Winter Garden, but this time the stillness belonged to me. My father's face didn't change immediately. It took a second for the sentence to land, the way bad news takes a second to land on anyone who spent their life assuming they'll always be the one delivering it instead of receiving it. "That's not," he started. "That review was through some subsidiary. Meridian never said. They weren't required to disclose the reviewing firm's ownership structure to you. That's standard. I signed a formal recusal from any future Callahan Brothers engagements in July of last year, at Marcus Whitfield's request, once the conflict became unavoidable. I slid a single page across the table, not the whole binder, just the recusal letter, dated, signed, on Callahan Voss letterhead. I've known about the subcontractor default, the change orders, and the board never being told the true scope of the loss for almost 2 years. Aunt Colleen shifted in her seat. Tyler, beside her, had gone very quiet, staring at the page in front of his father like it had rearranged the furniture of a room he thought he knew. My father's jaw tightened. "So this whole time you knew? You knew and you let me stand up in front of my partners and—" "I didn't let anything happen, Dad. You stood up in front of 11 men and called me worthless for refusing to co-sign a guarantee on numbers that didn't add up. I was right not to sign it. You signed it alone, and now you're $1.6 million short, and you drove to Columbus today to ask me to fix it, not because you miss me, but because Aunt Colleen ran the math in a group chat you didn't know I could see." I slid the second page across the table, the screenshot Tyler had accidentally sent me, Aunt Colleen's message still visible in full. "Pride isn't going to pay Meridian back." Aunt Colleen's face went the color of old drywall. "Tyler," she said, low, sharp, "you sent her that?" "I didn't mean to," Tyler said, and his voice cracked on it in a way that surprised me, because Tyler had never, in 30 years, sounded uncertain about anything in front of our father. "It was an accident. I swear. He stopped himself, looked at me instead of at Colleen, and something in his face shifted from panic into something closer to shame. She's not wrong, though, is she? That is what we were talking about. My father's hands, flat on the table, curled slightly at the knuckles. Not a fist, not quite, just the tension of a man realizing the floor he was standing on had already given way beneath him some time ago, and he was only now feeling the drop. You don't understand what's at stake here, he said, and his voice had lost the confident, expansive tone of a man laying out terms. It had narrowed into something quieter, more exposed. This is everything I built. 31 years. If Meridian forecloses, I don't just lose the project. I lose the company. Your grandmother's land is the only clean asset left that isn't already leveraged to the bank. The land is mine and Tyler's, I said. Not yours. It was never yours to leverage, which is exactly why you needed my signature and couldn't get it without asking. And you didn't ask. You went around me for 18 months, hoping the project would fix itself, and when it didn't, your sister told you the fastest way through it was to remind your daughter she still loves you enough to bail you out. That's not fair, Aunt Colleen said sharply. Nobody's using you, Harper. We're your family. Family doesn't audit my apartment, I said, and I said it evenly, without raising my voice, because I'd learned a long time ago that the coldest, most devastating things I could say were always the ones I said quietly. Dad spent 40 minutes in my living room 3 weeks ago asking about my retirement accounts and whether the firm owns its office outright. I let him, because I wanted to see exactly how far this would go before anyone said the actual number out loud. Well, here we are. The actual number is $1.6 million. Say it. Ask me directly. Instead of driving 4 hours with a portfolio full of paperwork Marcus already drew up assuming I'd say yes before I even heard the ask. My father was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice that had gone rougher, older, he said, Fine. I'm asking you directly. I need $1.6 million, Harper. I need it by the end of the month, or Meridian takes the project, and everything I've spent my life building goes with it. I'm asking my daughter for help. I reached into my bag and set the Kestrel binder on the table, the whole thing, navy blue, worn soft at the corners from 2 years of being opened and closed and added to. I didn't say anything for a moment, just let it sit there between us, thick with everything it contained. This is every piece of documentation from the last 2 years, I said. The engagement letter, the recusal, Denise's messages, Aunt Colleen's texts, the corporate minutes showing your board still doesn't know the full scope of the default 3 weeks after you told me it was under control. I'm not showing you this to hurt you. I'm showing you this because I need you to understand that I know exactly what happened on every side of it, and I'm still willing to sit in this room. My father looked at the binder like it was a stranger's face. You've been keeping a file on me, he said, and for the first time all afternoon, there was something in his voice that wasn't anger or pride, something closer to fear, small and unguarded, the voice of a man realizing how thoroughly he'd been seen by someone he'd spent her whole life underestimating. 2 years, Harper. You've been sitting on this for 2 years. I've been protecting myself for 2 years, I said. There's a difference. You taught me that difference, actually, without meaning to. Every time you handed Tyler a hard hat and handed me a compliment about my grades instead, you taught me that nobody in this family was going to keep my interests safe but me. So I learned to do it myself. That's not a weapon, Dad. That's a habit you built in me before I was 10 years old. Tyler made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like something breaking loose. Jesus, Dad, he said, quiet, almost to himself. The hard hat thing. I remember the hard hat thing. He looked at me, and there was something genuine in it. Something that had been building, I think, since the accidental text message. I didn't know it was like that for you. I mean, I knew, but I didn't know. I didn't answer him right away, because I wasn't ready yet to let anyone in that room off easily, even Tyler, even though some part of me believed him. My father exhaled, long and slow, and for a moment the bravado that had carried him through 31 years of job sites and closing arguments seemed to leave him all at once, leaving something smaller and more honest sitting in the chair across from me. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, and it was the first time in my entire life I'd heard my father say those exact words about anything. I don't know how to ask you for help without it feeling like I'm admitting I was wrong about you your whole life. And I was. I know I was. I knew it that night at the Winter Garden, the second it came out of my mouth, and I still didn't call you the next day to say so, because I didn't know how to say it without the whole thing collapsing. It wasn't the apology I'd imagined. In whatever version of this moment I'd let myself picture over 18 months of silence. It was smaller than that, more fumbling, more human, and somehow that made it land harder than a clean one would have. I'm not going to sign a bridge loan against my firm's equity, I said, and I watched Aunt Colleen's shoulders drop before I even finished the sentence. That was never on the table, and Marcus should have told you that before you had that portfolio drawn up. My firm isn't a family asset. It's mine. I built it without a hard hat with my name on it, and I'm not leveraging it to save a project I told you, in writing, not to move forward on without an independent audit. My father's face closed slightly, bracing, I think, for the door shutting entirely. But I wasn't finished. What I will do, I said, is have Priya and my team review the Kestrel Commons file properly, formally, this time with full access and full disclosure. The real numbers, the real liens, the real board minutes, and put together a restructuring plan Meridian might actually accept the same way I do it for any client. Not a rescue. A plan. It'll be my professional judgment, not family loyalty, and if the numbers say the project isn't salvageable, I'll tell you that too, and you'll have to hear it, the same way any other client would have to hear it from me. That's what I'm offering. Not $1.6 million. My actual expertise, which, it turns out, is worth considerably more than that number if anyone in this family had bothered to ask for it honestly at any point in the last decade. The room was quiet for a long moment. Aunt Colleen looked like she wanted to argue and thought better of it. Tyler looked, if anything, relieved, like some weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had shifted onto a structure built to hold it. My father looked at the binder, and then at me, and something in his face. I want to be precise about this, because it mattered to me more than I expected it to, softened into something I hadn't seen directed at me since I was 9 years old in a mudroom on Kestrel Lane, asking for a hard hat of my own. That's more than I deserve today, he said quietly. I know that. Probably, I said not unkindly. But I didn't build a career out of giving people only what they deserve, Dad. I built it out of figuring out what's actually salvageable and telling the truth about the rest. We didn't hug. I want to be honest about that too, because this isn't a story that ends with everyone crying and everything healed in an afternoon. My father left that conference room still carrying the weight of 31 years of pride, and I let him carry it because it wasn't mine to lift for him. But he shook my hand on his way out, an actual handshake firm, the kind he'd have given a business partner, which was, in its own strange way, the most honest form of respect he knew how to offer, and I took it because I understood, finally, that it was the only currency he had left to pay me in, and I'd rather be paid honestly in a small coin than falsely in a large one. Tyler stayed behind for a few minutes after Aunt Colleen and my father left. He stood in the doorway, hands in his jacket pockets, and said, "For what it's worth, I never thought you were worthless. I just never said anything, because saying something felt like it would cost me something with him. That's on me. I'm sorry it took 2 years and an accidental text for me to say it out loud. It's worth something," I told him, and I meant it. Not everything, but something. Over the following 6 weeks, my firm conducted a full formal review of Callahan Brothers Construction, the real one, this time, with complete access, board oversight restored, Tyler's title finally ratified properly by an actual board vote once I insisted the governance issues be corrected as a condition of the engagement. The numbers were bad, but not unsalvageable. Kestrel Commons was restructured with a revised completion timeline, a renegotiated draw schedule with Meridian, and a hard, uncomfortable conversation my father had to have with his own board about the 18 months he'd spent concealing the truth from them, a conversation I didn't have to force. He had it himself, unprompted, 3 days after our meeting, which told me more about where he'd actually landed than any handshake could have. The company survived. Not because I rescued it, and I want to be exact about that distinction, because it's the whole thesis of everything that happened after the Winter Garden. It survived because my father finally let the truth into the room, and once it was in the room, the problem turned out to be solvable, the way most problems are solvable once you stop hiding the real numbers from the people who could actually help you read them. I still keep the Kestrel binder. It sits on a shelf in my office now instead of a corner of my desk, Not because I need it anymore, but because I think everyone should keep some version of it. Not as a weapon, but as a record. Proof that you saw clearly even when the people who were supposed to see you clearly first didn't. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this. The people who call you worthless are very rarely talking about your actual worth. They're talking about the version of you that's inconvenient to their plans. And those are two entirely different things, even when they're delivered in the same sentence, in front of the same 11 people at the same steakhouse table. You don't have to forgive that overnight. I didn't. It took me 2 years, a filing cabinet full of documentation, and a lot of quiet, unglamorous work proving to myself, before I ever proved it to anyone else, that I was never the one who needed fixing. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments. I read all of them, I promise. Subscribe if you want more stories like Harper's. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. And share this with anyone who's ever been called something they had to spend years quietly disproving. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.